Chapter 2: Linguistic Unity. 1. Choice of language on a local scale in the framework of a given territory. Let us take Senegal as an example. Before any choice could be made, the kinship of the various tongues spoken in Senegal had to be demonstrated, which may not be as easily done in other territories. By setting out linguistic rules that would allow passage in a systematic way from Wolof forms to Serer, Pil to Koler, and Diola, we demonstrated the deep kinship uniting the various segments of the Senegalese population. The importance of this demonstration is that it shows us a kinship, the ignorance of which had kept alive until the present local particularities, Serer, Diola, or Tokoler, at times as effectively uniting as many nations. Quite objectively, in a country such as Senegal, Wolof is the obvious choice for a national language, a language of government. All minorities are nearly bilingual, speaking Wolof in addition to their primary language. It can be seen that within the local context, cultural languages, such as Peol to Koler, fall into the class of minority groupings, whereas it is quite another matter in regions such as, say, Fouta Djallon or the northern Cameroons. 2. Elevation of the selected language to the level of a modern cultural and government language. It is in Wolof that researchers today are trying systematically to introduce all the concepts required to convey the exact sciences, mathematics, physics, philosophy, and so on. An appropriate Senegalese government will one day apply a cultural policy aimed at favoring the development of the language in optimal order. It will be necessary to use artificial but effective methods, such as founding literary prizes, translating scientific works, creating a national commission to draw up an academic dictionary, and various specialized ones for mathematics, physics, philosophy, and so on. Even now, we must start such work on a limited scale, in order to show once and for all that it is indeed possible to raise an African language to the prestige of any of the European cultural languages. What has so far been done and continues in this regard in Wolof has only exemplary value. Similar work must be judiciously carried out in the framework of each territory. The same criteria of selection will have to be applied in determining the territorial language, with the same delicate study beforehand of linguistic, ethnic, and other considerations in order to reduce any possibility of offending regional sensibilities. As quickly as possible, Wolof should become the language of government, used in public and political documents and acts, parliamentary debate, drawing up of the Constitution, and legal code. Until now, we have been in a period in which knowledge of the colonizing power's language was a prerequisite for holding any public office, especially that of deputy or legislator. Participating in debate in the French Parliament made this indispensable. It is a paradox to continue such a state of affairs in any given African state. The major part of the population in any territory is still totally without knowledge of French. One can see that to elect people's representatives on outmoded criteria is patently inadequate and unjust. Using the colonizer's language is a convenient way to avoid facing the true complaints of the population, who may be illiterate but are not without good sense. 3. Choice of language on a continental scale. When our demonstrations in Wolof have gone far enough, they will have proved that in due time it will be possible appropriately to choose one of the major African tongues and promote it to the level of sole governmental and cultural language for the entire continent. It will cover all territorial languages in the same way that Russian is overlaid on the language of each socialist republic within the Soviet Union. The choice of such language will have to be made by a competent interterritorial commission imbued with deep patriotic feeling, forswearing any hidden chauvinism. The language thus selected will at first be taught in the secondary schools of all territories, just as if it were an obligatory foreign language in the curriculum. Then, As textbooks on various subjects are completed in this language and adopted in high schools and colleges, the continental language will take the place of European languages as the vehicle for our modern national culture. European languages will not disappear from our schools, but will progressively drop back to the position of elective foreign languages learned on a secondary school level. A citizen of any given territory will be obliged to learn to speak fluently the continental language while still being able to get secondary and even higher education in the territorial tongue. Black writers and artists at their Rome Convention, Easter 1959, and the Federation of African Students in France at its July 1959 seminar at Rennes both officially adopted this view of the necessity and character of linguistic unity. During the transitional period, European languages will continue to be used, but that situation must not be allowed to endure too long, lest it eventually turn Africa into a super Switzerland. There is nothing to be gained by urging simultaneous perpetuation of French, English, Portuguese, Spanish, and Afrikaans, and why opt for exclusive use of either French or English? We must remain circumspect about subtle efforts to Anglo-Americanize black Africa, considering how many of the colonies were formerly British. The joint efforts of Great Britain and of the United States especially run counter to established intellectual habits and suggest to former French, Portuguese, Spanish, or other colonies that they ought to opt for English, so as to make that tongue the lingua franca of the whole continent. Linguistic unity based on a foreign language, however one may look at it, is cultural abortion. It would irremediably eventuate in the death of the authentic national culture, the end of our deeper intellectual and spiritual life, and reduce us to perpetual copycats, having missed out on our historical mission in this world. Anglo-Saxon cultural, economic, social, and even political hegemony would thereby be permanently guaranteed throughout black Africa. We must remain radically opposed to any attempts at cultural assimilation coming from the outside. None is possible without opening the way to the others. One might say that it makes no difference to a Wolof speaking African whether he adopts Zulu or English or Portuguese. This is just not so. An African educated in any African language other than his own is less alienated, culturally speaking, than he is when educated in a European language, which takes the place of his mother tongue. Likewise, a Frenchman who got an Italian education would be much less alienated than if inculcated with Zulu or Arabic in place of French. Such is the disparity in cultural interests which exist between European and African languages, something we must never lose sight of. European languages must not be considered diamonds displayed under a glass bell, dazzling us with their brilliance. Our attention must rather be fixed on their historical development. Creatively, we discover that similar paths are open to all. The influence of language is so great that the various European mother countries feel they can afford to withdraw politically from Africa without great loss as long as their linguistic presence remains in the economic, spiritual, and cultural spheres. They assume that one-time colonies will officially retain the colonizer's language. Anything else would be disappointing, ungrateful, and unacceptable. Such a design is impossible of realization, even though former colonies continue to honor the tongue of the mother country as the prime foreign language in high school curricula. We are not at all talking of a radical cultural severance. Because of the huge difficulties to be overcome in mastering the African linguistic mosaic, some observers in Europe are convinced that we will not be up to the challenge, that we will be unable to undertake a change requiring so much human energy, so much intellectual lucidity, so much creative thinking. If they do not actually sneer, they are nonetheless sure that the drive for African cultural unity will fail. Cultural surrender is a foregone conclusion. in view of the ignorance of vital problems that extends to some of our most responsible political leaders. Political independence to a certain degree is, yes, what they envision now. None of what makes for the greatness of modern nations in national culture or even economic infrastructure will, when all is said and done, ever exist among us, they assume. On the other hand, they firmly expect perpetuation of the cultural mix they create, and one can already hear the pseudo-dialectical phrases that will be used to try to legitimize such a state of affairs in the name of efficiency, progress, planetary unity, and what have you. Our generation is out of luck, so to speak, in what we will not be able to avoid the intellectual storm. Willy-nilly, we will be forced to take the bull by the horns, to rid our minds of the intellectual formulas and tidbits of thought in order to enter resolutely upon the only truly dialectical path toward the solution of the problems that history forces upon us. This connotes active research, in the most authentic meaning of that term, by clear and fertile minds capable of proposing effective solutions and realizing them without intellectual guardianship. Historical circumstances now demand of our generation that it solve in a felicitous manner the vital problems that face Africa, most especially the cultural problem. If we do not succeed in this, we will appear in the history of the development of our people as the watershed generation that was unable to ensure the unified cultural survival of the African continent, the generation which, out of political and intellectual blindness, committed the error fatal to our national future. We will have been the unworthy generation par excellence. The selection of a single language for the continent, one which any foreigner, whether French, English, Russian, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, or other, would have to learn to communicate with any African on our black continent, would thus obviously lead to a simplification of our intercourse with the outside world. International relations, far from being more complicated, would become much easier. Chapter 3: Political Unity and Federalism. The historical significance of national liberation movements in colonies, especially those of black Africa, is no longer open to question. It is now readily admitted that this powerful decolonizing drive is as significant as the national movements of Europe during the 19th century. Apart from those colonies largely peopled by Europeans, where resistance is inevitable, with few exceptions, there is less and less violent opposition to the development of the movement. The new tactic rather consists in trying to direct it, channeling it toward non-socialistic forms of the so-called Western type. If this goal were to be reached, the former colonial powers and the United States might stop worrying. Black Africa would be not Balkanized, for the political regimes of the Balkan countries are now relatively stable, but South Americanized. It would be made up of a proliferation of little dictator-ridden countries, without organic ties one to another, ephemeral, afflicted with chronic weakness, governed by terror with the help of outsized police forces, but under economic domination by foreign countries, pulling strings through the mere presence of an embassy. This was the case in Guatemala, where the following extraordinary situation occurred. A foreign business firm, the United Fruit Company, U.S., overthrew the local government and replaced it with another more amenable to the company's aims, working in conjunction with the American Embassy and, as we now know, the CIA, thus proving the emptiness of the so-called independence of such a state. If we are to protect black Africa from such a fate, the idea of federation must actually constitute, for all of us, especially those in high political positions, a method of survival by way of an efficacious political and economic organization to be set up in optimum time, not just a dilatory demagogic formation receiving merely lip service. We must stop fooling the masses with minor patchwork and bring about the ultimate break with all the fake structures, Communart, Commonwealth, Euro-Africa, which have no historical future. Black Africa must finally and definitely be started up the slope toward its federal destiny. We cannot go on running with the hare and hunting with the hounds. The African countries in the years ahead will be forced progressively to strengthen their organic federal ties while ridding themselves of the remains of those that bind them still to their former quote-unquote mother countries. This need in no way result in economic chaos. West Africa alone, if federated, has an economic potential greater than that of France and England combined. That is, greater than that of the two countries most likely to impose economic sanctions on us. Naturally, that economic potential has to be developed. This creates problems of manpower and investment. In part 2 of this program, we outline the path which can lead to the success of such an undertaking. Those in political power are the only ones who have not proved themselves up to coping with these problems, who indeed have never seriously given thought to them, who are terrified of taking the action which they conceive as economic weaning. They rather attempt, while acting as a screen, to perpetuate the same old economic political guardianship in a more insidious manner, less visible to the masses, but no less effective. The proliferation of political leaders is a specifically African fact of life, resulting from colonization by different imperial powers and the consequent breaking up into administrative territories of conquered regions. It constitutes a serious difficulty that will have to be taken into account in any attempts at African continental unification. No concrete way has yet been proposed that might lead inevitably and rapidly to a federation of African states with partial or total surrender of local sovereignty. For all the fine public statements, multifarious individual and general interest are at work to make people cling to the established frontiers of the various territories. No one has ever suggested any sort of cartel of presidents or heads of states as an embryo federal government, which might be broadened gradually as the various states become emancipated. This might be the way to provide a collective directorship within which no one chief of state would hold the top position, pending full independence of the continent. Individual states' interests could thus be safeguarded at the same time as African unity. On the other hand, the establishment of some kind of consultative assembly, the organization of a Latin American type debating society, can in the long run lead only to an increasingly tolerated and finally fully accepted ossification of the various frontiers of African states. This would unavoidably mean a mosaic, as in South America. Continental states. Unification of the entire planet does not seem likely in the immediate future, whatever a superficial mind might think of it. The social consciousness of the world at this juncture is far from having been sufficiently awakened for certain half-hidden feelings to be extirpated from it. Eternal vigilance remains an urgent prerequisite to eventual world unity. What are sometimes called grand designs do not readily fit in with the history and interest of peoples. When the true faults within them become apparent, they will doubtless follow the shape of continents for a period now difficult to assess. Nor will that period under any circumstances be shortened by anything but mutual respect or fear of one another's powers. Sincere fraternization and the unity of the planet will be possible only when the various peoples are equal in strength and advance to the point where none can any longer hope to deceive any of the others. The formation of continental states would appear to be a preliminary step toward planetary unity. This is the more likely since Europe, which by itself colonized nearly all of the globe, might well take umbrage when it reaches the end of its delusions and clearly understands it has lost all of its former colonies. European unification in that case might be based on bitterness as suggested by certain flare-ups of neo-Nazism, perhaps less devoid of deeper significance than some have alleged. Europe might well turn in upon itself and adopt a neo-nationalism encompassing all of Western Europe. Hunger in the year 2000. A short-sighted political leader might today drive his country toward catastrophe. Despite all the improvements in living conditions that can be anticipated from the amazing accomplishments of science, some problems, such as feeding the Earth's uncontrollably growing population, will not be solved in the near future. Scientists are already wondering how we will feed the 6 billion inhabitants of the globe in the year 2000, less than a quarter century from now. This is of such urgency that a branch of the United Nations, the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, was given the job of studying world hunger. All it came up with is the suggestion that the underdeveloped countries be fed on fish meal. Other scientists have been urging the cultivation of algae. Some influential American groups have even recommended to their government that its foreign economic aid be restricted to those underdeveloped nations which agree to limit their birth rates. This is an obvious Malthusian approach. Repopulation of Africa. It is clear that a continent such as Black Africa, the sole victim of slavery in modern times, with 100 to 200 million people killed or carried away, can only turn a deaf ear on any such suggestions. Our continent, with its demographic emptiness, has an imperative duty to apply a systematic policy of intensive repopulation in optimum time. Black Africa contains sufficient sources of natural energy, raw materials, and foodstuffs to feed and sustain such a population. It must avoid in the future becoming the receptacle for the rest of the world's human overflow. It cannot consider large-scale immigration from abroad, even for its least populated regions, such as Central Africa, until it has regained a strong national personality capable of assimilating the outlander instead of vice versa. All the hypocritical decisions that might be conceived along these lines on an international level by any organization, however apparently prestigious, must be rejected out of hand by us. Along these lines, the 1960 conference held at Tangier by a UN commission presided over by the late Dag Hammarskjöld was a straw in the wind. The then Secretary General forthrightly expressed the opinion that the appearance of Africa on the world political scene would within the year create a problem concerning representation of two different categories of countries, dramatically differing not only in their levels of capabilities, but even more so in their numbers: the technically developed and the underdeveloped nations. This suggested that a reorganization of the statutes might be considered, so that the influence of older quote-unquote civilized European countries would not be outweighed by the mass of newcomers. This would mean nothing less than a directorate, already advocated by some heads of states. But how could this result in anything other than the failure of the entire organization? The Yellow Peril. The West's frenzied haste to undertake disarmament reflects a latent malaise, a hidden fear, which had seemed to be gone forever, that of the Yellow Peril. The more or less skillfully conducted debates have shown that the aim has been to bring France into line on the question of atomic capability, so as to set a moral precedent that might be used, when needed, to condemn China to perpetual military inferiority by keeping her out of the atomic club. The interest of the capitalist world as a whole would have, of course, dictated that France give up becoming an atomic power. Not only would she thus have shown her willingness to stay in line, but also the higher interest of the Western camp would have been safeguarded to the extent that, having already its own atomic weapons, it could use a moral argument to dissuade China from developing any. The latter country is, after all, a yellowed or colored power. In certain circles, one often hears expressions of concern at seeing such a power appear and fear of what it might become by the year 2000, with a full arsenal of atomic weapons. There is talk of China overflowing, of it swallowing up Europe in a full-scale replay of Attila the Hun. Efforts are made, by various means which may well have a broader scope at a later date, artificially to keep this absurd fear alive in non-socialist minds and consciences, the idea being to stimulate a panic causing reflexive reactions in self-defense. What is especially feared is rapprochement between Asia and Africa. The fact that France failed to hear the call and that the moral political maneuver directed against China did not work out merely proves, if proof still be needed, that the capitalist world is full of insurmountable contradictions. Many Western politicos and military men welcome the split that has occurred between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, which is interpreted as the same kind of self-defense reflex on the part of the USSR, a quote-unquote white nation having conquered part of Asia. They hope to see the rift maintained despite any socialist objectives and interests those two powers might have. Frontiers. How far would the federated African state extend? Roughly speaking, from the Tropic of Cancer to the Cape, from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. In L'Afrique Noire Pre-Coloniale, we showed what had been the historical frontiers of those old Western African black empires. They virtually followed the Tropic of Cancer. The border province of Taghiza is on that parallel. We know the name of one of the last black governors there representing the Askia of Kayoga, the Taghiza Manzo, Mohammed Ikoma. The Saharan zone that separates the Tropic of Cancer from the latitude of Sijilmessa has never known constituted authority. It was the appanage of the Mesufer Berbers, who for a fee served as guides to caravans going through the corridors of the desert which they had explored. I think there was a great merit in the idea put forth by the late Moroccan progressive Mehdi Ben Barka when he said that all questions of frontiers today are made inoperative by the general evolution of Africa as a whole.